Muammar Gaddafi promised peace and freedom, but Libyans realized his true self soon. How he treated them is beyond imagination. Entire families were silenced, and countless lives were destroyed. Yet, in the end, fate caught up with him in a way unlike anything the world had ever seen. Muammar Gaddafi was one of the most powerful men in Africa. Born on June 7, 1942, near Sirte, Libya, he rose from a poor Bedouin family to become the ruler of an oil-rich nation. In 1969, at just 27 years old, he led a group of young officers to overthrow King Idris I. They called it the Free Officers Movement. Overnight, Gaddafi became the leader of Libya. By the 1970s, he wasn't just the head of state. He was the state itself. Every major decision, big or small, went through him. He announced a new system called the Jamahiriya, which he said would give power to the people. He claimed that Libyans would rule themselves through local committees, without politicians or parties. But in truth, it only gave him more power. Everything still revolved around him. People quickly realized that disagreeing with Gaddafi meant danger. To make sure everyone followed his vision, he wrote the Green Book, a small manual explaining how he thought Libya should be run. It became required reading in schools and workplaces. Teachers had to teach it, and students were tested on it. The book rejected both capitalism and communism, claiming Libya had found its own third way. In theory, it sounded revolutionary, but in reality, it made Gaddafi's ideas untouchable. His words replaced the country's laws, and questioning them was seen as an attack on the nation itself. His image was everywhere, on street walls, school books, and even currency. It created a culture of worship around him. But behind this image of strength was a system built on fear. Secret police watched everyone. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Those who spoke against him simply disappeared. Some were sent to remote prisons, like Abu Salim, where many never returned. People learned to stay silent, even in their own homes. Still, Gaddafi managed to stay in power through a mix of charm, manipulation, and fear. He avoided revolts by giving favors to tribes that supported him, and punishing those that didn't. Over time, he became known as the Brother Leader, a title that made him sound close to the people, but also untouchable. His influence stretched beyond Libya. He wanted to be seen as a hero across Africa and the Arab world. He sent money, weapons, and support to rebel groups in countries like Chad, Uganda, and even Northern Ireland. Many world leaders accused him of funding terrorism. His government was linked to the 1986 bombing of a Berlin nightclub that killed U.S. soldiers, and the 1988 Lockerbie plane explosion over Scotland, which killed 270 people. These attacks made him one of the most hated figures in the West. In April 1986, the U.S. struck back. American warplanes bombed Tripoli and Benghazi in an operation called El Dorado Canyon. Gaddafi barely survived. Several of his homes were destroyed, and his adopted daughter Khana was killed in the attack. He used that tragedy to paint himself as a victim of Western aggression. From that day, his anger toward the United States grew stronger, and he tightened his grip on power even more. But time changes everything. By the late 1990s, Gaddafi's isolation had hurt Libya's economy. Sanctions had crippled the country. Oil sales had dropped, and people were growing restless. To survive, he began to change his image. He released political prisoners, opened talks with Western countries, and promised to give up his secret weapons programs. In 2003, after years of tension, he admitted responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing and agreed to pay compensation to the victims' families. This marked the start of a strange new phase. Western leaders, once enemies, began to shake his hand. British Prime Minister Tony Blair visited him in 2004, calling it a new relationship. France's Nicolas Sarkozy also welcomed him. For the first time in decades, Gaddafi was being treated like a world leader again. He returned to the global stage, wearing his trademark robes, smiling beside the same countries that once bombed him. But beneath the surface, his people were still suffering and living in fear. Libya was one of the richest countries in Africa because of its massive oil reserves. The money from oil exports could have built modern cities, good schools, and hospitals for everyone. But instead, most of that wealth stayed in the hands of Gaddafi and his inner circle. He used the nation's money to build grand palaces, fund his personal projects, and keep his loyalists happy. His family enjoyed private jets, luxury cars, and lavish parties abroad, while many Libyans lived in poverty. The gap between the rich and the poor grew larger every year. Gaddafi's sons became symbols of excess. Saif al-Islam, who was once seen as the educated face of the family, studied in London and was known for his expensive taste. Another son, Mutassim, spent large sums on parties and entertainment. Hannibal Gaddafi became famous for his violent behavior during his travels. While they lived like royalty, ordinary Libyans struggled to find stable jobs, proper housing, or even affordable food. People started to feel that the country's riches were stolen from them. Inside Libya, Gaddafi's rule reached every corner of life. His security network was led by his powerful intelligence chief, Abdullah Sanusi, a man feared across the country. Sanusi ran a system that kept people constantly afraid. There were informants in offices, schools, and even mosques. People never knew who might be listening. A careless comment about Gaddafi could lead to arrest or torture. Many citizens learned to keep their thoughts to themselves, even within their own families. The country's media was tightly controlled. Newspapers and TV stations praised Gaddafi every day, while real news about poverty or corruption never appeared. The government claimed that people were free to speak through popular committees, but these were just another layer of control. They reported anyone who criticized the government. By 2010, frustration was quietly spreading. The unemployment rate among youth was one of the highest in the region. Many young people dreamed of leaving the country, seeing no hope for change. Women, too, faced limits. Even though Gaddafi claimed to support equality, opportunities for them were controlled by the regime. The country looked calm on the surface, but beneath it, anger was growing. Decades of silence, fear, and broken promises were building up, and it was only a matter of time before that silence turned into something much louder. In early 2011, a wave of change swept across the Arab world. Ordinary people in several countries were rising up against decades of corruption, injustice, and fear. It started in Tunisia, where protests forced President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali to flee the country after 23 years in power. Not long after, Egypt's longtime ruler, Hosni Mubarak, was also overthrown after millions filled the streets of Cairo demanding freedom. These uprisings were broadcast across Arab television and social media, and the images gave people everywhere the courage to believe that change was possible. In Libya, the timing couldn't have been more explosive. The idea that people could actually stand up to a ruler and win suddenly felt real. The spark came on February 15, 2011 in Benghazi, a city known for its strong sense of community and history of resistance. A few dozen people gathered outside a police station to demand the release of Fatih Terbil, a young lawyer who had been arrested for defending the families of prisoners killed at the Abu Salim prison massacre in 1996. That massacre had taken the lives of more than 1,200 inmates, and for years the government denied it ever happened. Terbil had become a symbol of truth and courage, and his arrest was the final straw. At first, the protest was calm. People held signs and chanted peacefully, calling for justice and reform, not revolution. But when Gaddafi's forces showed up, everything changed. They opened fire on the crowd without warning. Bullets hit unarmed civilians. The shock and anger spread instantly. Families who had stayed silent for decades could no longer hold back. Benghazi erupted overnight. Within days, the protests spread beyond Benghazi to other cities like Misrata, Al-Baida, and Zawiya. People began tearing down Gaddafi's posters and burning government buildings. By February 20th, Benghazi was engulfed in chaos. Police stations were destroyed, security offices looted, and protesters filled the main squares. For Gaddafi, this was the first real threat to his rule in over 40 years. But he refused to surrender. He appeared on television shouting angrily, calling the protesters rats, traitors, and foreign agents. He claimed that Libya was his land and that no one had the right to take it from him. He swore to fight until his last breath, no matter how many people opposed him. His threats quickly turned into action, and what followed was pure brutality. Government forces launched massive attacks on cities that had joined the uprising. Tanks rolled through the streets of Misrata, Ajdabia, and Zawiya, crushing cars and tearing down buildings. Warplanes flew low, dropping bombs on crowded neighborhoods and hospitals. Soldiers fired without mercy into crowds of unarmed protesters, killing men, women, and even children who had taken to the streets demanding freedom. The situation worsened by the day. Electricity was cut off, water supplies were destroyed, and many areas were left in total darkness. Hospitals ran out of medicine, and doctors were forced to treat the wounded on floors and sidewalks, surrounded by chaos and blood. By the end of February, human rights groups began documenting the horror. Reports showed thousands of people killed and many more missing without a trace. But the violence had the opposite effect of what Gaddafi intended. Instead of breaking the people's spirit, it united them. The pain and loss turned into anger and determination. Entire towns and tribes joined the revolution, standing together against the regime. Many soldiers and officers abandoned Gaddafi's forces, refusing to kill their own people. These defected fighters, along with local militias and civilians, began to organize themselves. From this unity, the National Transitional Council was formed in Benghazi. It became the main voice of the revolution, made up of rebels, former officials, and ordinary citizens. Their goal was to end Gaddafi's 42-year rule and build a new, free Libya. However, Gaddafi's forces were still stronger and far more equipped. His loyal commanders, including his son Muammar Gaddafi, led elite military units armed with tanks, rockets, and aircraft. They launched counterattacks, quickly retaking several key cities and pushing rebel fighters into retreat. By early March 2011, the rebels were cornered. Gaddafi's army was now closing in on Benghazi. He promised to cleanse the city, and everyone knew what that meant. The world couldn't ignore it anymore. In March 2011, the United Nations took action. After weeks of reports showing civilians being bombed and killed, the UN approved a no-fly zone over Libya. This meant Gaddafi's warplanes were no longer allowed to fly, and if they did, they would be shot down. The goal was to protect the people, but this decision completely changed the course of the war. What had begun as a local rebellion had now become an international conflict. Soon, the skies over Libya were filled with foreign jets from countries like the United States, France, and Libya. Loud explosions echoed across the country as missiles struck military bases, tanks, and radar systems. For many Libyans, this was the first time they felt the balance of power shift in their favor. NATO's airstrikes crippled Gaddafi's heavy weapons and cut off communication between his commanders, leaving his army scattered and confused. Still, the battles on the ground were brutal. Rebel forces were made up mostly of civilians, students, and defected soldiers who had little training and few resources. They used old rifles, homemade weapons, and captured equipment from Gaddafi's troops. Yet their determination was stronger than ever. In cities like Misrata, the fighting turned street by street. Families hid in their homes as tanks rolled past, while others joined the rebels to defend their neighborhoods. Despite the endless shelling and heavy losses, they refused to back down. As weeks turned into months, Gaddafi's tone began to change. His speeches, once filled with anger and pride, now sounded desperate. He accused NATO of trying to destroy Libya and warned his followers that the West wanted to steal the country's oil. But his words no longer had the same power. His once loyal generals started fleeing. Ambassadors resigned, and government officials escaped to neighboring countries. Even in Tripoli, his own capital, people began to lose faith. Whispers of rebellion grew louder as fear slowly turned into courage. By August 2011, Gaddafi's regime was crumbling. NATO airstrikes had destroyed most of his tanks, command centers, and supply lines. Rebel forces finally saw their chance to strike Tripoli. Thousands of fighters from different parts of Libya began moving toward the capital. The battles were intense. Snipers took positions on rooftops, explosions echoed through the narrow streets, and gunfire could be heard day and night. On August 23, 2011, the rebels stormed Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's massive compound in the center of Tripoli. For years it had been a symbol of his absolute power, surrounded by high walls, bunkers, and guards. But now the gates were broken, and the compound was burning. Rebels tore down his portraits, waved their flags, and shouted in victory. Gaddafi and his family fled the capital in chaos. His son, Saif al-Islam, who had once been seen as his political heir and the modern face of the regime, went into hiding. Other sons, like Kamis and Mutasim, were killed in the fierce battles that followed. After fleeing Tripoli, Gaddafi began a desperate journey west toward his birthplace, the coastal city of Sirte. Traveling in a small convoy of vehicles, he was surrounded by his most loyal guards, a few family members, and his security chief, Mansour Dao. They moved through desert roads at night, hiding by day, constantly changing locations to escape NATO's drones and the rebel patrols searching for him. Every move had to be secret. Even those who sheltered him were terrified, knowing that helping Gaddafi could cost them their lives. By early October, Sirte had become the last stronghold of his regime. It was under siege. NATO airstrikes hit the city every day, destroying military targets and cutting off any possible escape routes. Rebel forces tightened their grip, surrounding Sirte from every direction. For the civilians trapped inside, life became unbearable. Food supplies vanished, water was scarce, and hospitals were overwhelmed. Families hid in basements as bombs fell overhead. Inside Sirte, Gaddafi refused to give up. Even when it was clear that his power was gone, he convinced himself that loyal tribes would rise to save him. He dreamed of leading a final counterattack, though his world had now shrunk to just a few damaged streets. His fighters were exhausted and hungry. Communication lines were destroyed, cutting him off from the outside world. By late October 2011, the situation in Sirte had completely collapsed. But for Gaddafi, dying in battle was better than being captured. At dawn on October 20th, Gaddafi decided to make one last attempt to escape. Around 50 vehicles formed a convoy, carrying his son Mutasim, top aides, and a handful of loyal guards. They planned to break through the rebel lines and flee south toward the desert, where they might regroup or seek shelter in friendly tribal areas. Mansour Dao helped organize the escape. But at around 8:30 a.m., NATO forces spotted the convoy moving near District 2 of Sirte. Within minutes, French warplanes and U.S. drones launched a deadly strike. Missiles and bombs rained down on the vehicles, creating a firestorm of explosions. Dozens were killed instantly, and others ran for cover as the convoy was torn apart. Gaddafi's vehicle was damaged, but not completely destroyed. Disoriented and bleeding from a head wound, he crawled out of the wreckage with his guards. They ran across the road, trying to escape the gunfire that followed. In the chaos, they found an old concrete drainage pipe by the roadside and climbed inside, hoping to hide until the fighting stopped. Minutes later, rebel fighters reached the drainage pipe. They were shocked at what they saw. Inside, crouched and wounded, was Muammar Gaddafi, the man who had ruled their country for more than 4 decades. His face was covered in blood and dust, his clothes torn, and his golden pistol lay beside him in the dirt. The fighters pulled him out roughly, their emotions running wild. Some shouted in disbelief, others in rage. Crowds began to form as word spread through Sirte that Gaddafi had been captured. Within minutes, dozens surrounded him, screaming and pushing. The scene quickly turned chaotic. Cell phone cameras recorded everything as rebels hit and kicked him. Some wanted to take him alive for trial, while others demanded revenge. The atmosphere was filled with anger and years of built-up pain. In the confusion, gunfire broke out. No one is entirely sure who fired the fatal shots, but Gaddafi was struck several times. He collapsed, bleeding heavily. His son Mutassim, captured not far from him, was also wounded and later killed while in custody. When Gaddafi's body was loaded onto a vehicle and taken to Misrata, it was clear he would not survive. By the time they arrived, he was already dead. The news spread instantly across Libya and the world. In Misrata, his body was placed inside a cold storage freezer in a local market so that people could come and see it for themselves. For many, it was the first real proof that the era of fear was truly over. After 3 days, officials decided to bury him secretly in the desert. His grave was left unmarked to make sure no one could turn it into a shrine. With that, the long and violent rule of Muammar Gaddafi came to a grim end. But the happiness didn't last long. Without Gaddafi, Libya had no stable government, no strong institutions, and too many rival militias. Cities like Misrata, Tripoli, and Benghazi became battlegrounds once again, this time between Libyans themselves. By 2014, the country was split into competing governments and warlords. Armed groups controlled different regions. Extremist organizations, including ISIS, took advantage of the chaos. Ordinary Libyans suffered once again, without security, food, or stable jobs. Even today, years after his death, Libya remains deeply divided.